Welcome to Friday Forum. I'm Andrew Kallick, and I'm a member of City Club's Board of Governors and a co-producer of today's program. For more than 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. Today, we're a diverse network of people who are eager to learn, connect, and share ideas for a better Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland. And thank you to the thousands of people who are joining us online, on the radio, and on TV. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app. Our radio audience is listening via X-Ray FM's stations at 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. And TV viewers will watch today's program via Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for the support of media partners in bringing City Club forums to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs every week. A special thank you today goes out to the Chalkboard Project for sponsoring our discussion. We'd also like to thank the Oregonian for being a promotional partner today. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Today we are trying out a new format. Who says you can't teach old dogs new tricks? After we hear from Oregon House Speaker Tina Kotek, we'll have 6 prepared questions from people who represent specific communities in Oregon. And after those questions, we'll open up the floor to all of you here at the Sentinel and tuning in online and over the air for your questions. Don't be shy to let us know what you think of the new format. You rarely are shy with us. So I don't think I have much to worry about, but we appreciate any and all feedback. Okay, let's dive in. In 2019, what happened in Salem didn't stay in Salem. Instead, our legislature made headlines across the country, sometimes for big, bold initiatives, and other times for violent rhetoric and partisan political tactics that made some wonder whether the Oregon way was a thing of the past. It's within this context that we hear today from House Speaker Tina Kotek. We'll not only hear about the bills that did and did not pass, spanning a range of issues from education and the environment to housing and paid leave, but we'll also have a conversation about the culture at the Capitol and whether she believes that Oregon can buck the national trend of hyper-partisan rancor and take proactive steps to change the culture in Salem for the betterment of all Oregonians. Tina Kotek needs no introduction in Oregon, but let me share a few notes from her bio. The speaker began her public service career with the Oregon Food Bank and went on to serve as the policy director for Children First for Oregon. In 2006, she was elected to the Oregon House of Representatives, and in 2013, she became the first openly lesbian speaker of any state house in the country. Please join me in welcoming Tina Kotek.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the City Club of Portland for the opportunity today to reflect on a truly historic session. So thank you for being here today. More significant legislation passed this year than in any session over the past decade, and probably over the last several decades here in Oregon. Observers will look to the supermajority threshold that Democrats crossed after last November's elections as a defining factor for this success. And there's some truth to that. But certainly all the efforts of the progressive-minded Oregonians during the campaign season made an incredible difference on election night and for opening the door for more conversations during this session. But in the Capitol, in such a dynamic and time-limited environment, so much of what is possible is set by what priorities are established at the beginning. And success is also grounded in the hours and hours of work that are done even before the session starts in January. We came into the session at a difficult moment in our nation's history. We're in a very transformative time here in our country, and states must step up to a greater role to address challenges faced at the local level and, frankly, to overcome the inaction at the federal level. Here in Oregon, many important bills were finally achievable this year because of previous incomplete attempts and determined efforts by advocates over time. And I really want to stress that the bottom line for this session is really this. Big things, after many years of trying, finally got done in Salem. So let me start by summarizing how we did on the big four priorities that the governor, the Senate president, and I set right after the election last year. Education funding, Medicaid stability, housing, and carbon reduction. So the Student Success Act. The legislature, as you know, has struggled for over 30 years to come up with a dedicated funding source for education here in the state to make up for that gap in funding that is the result of property tax reforms 3 decades ago. After the failure of Measure 97 at the ballot in 2016, and an unsuccessful effort in the 2017 session to refresh the discussion on education funding, the Senate president and I determined that we needed a different path. So we established the Joint Committee on Student Success. This bipartisan committee traveled across the state to hear directly from educators and parents, administrators, people in every community in the state, to figure out what we needed to give our children to make sure they have the schools that they deserve. Many members of the House and Senate, both Republican and Democrat, have said that that experience was one of the highlights of their legislative careers. And these collaborative conversations, as well as hours of public process, led to the Student Success Act, House Bill 3427. This new law will soon provide an additional $1 billion in education funding every year to give school districts the critical investments they need. And that list is long. Those investments are many, and things like more behavioral health supports for our students, increased learning time, smaller class sizes, full funding of career and technical education, more art, physical education, music, and library services, universal access to school meals was part of the package, bullying and suicide prevention, special education funding, expanded summer learning programs, and I could go on. New investments that our schools desperately need. And in the course of this process, education experts also consistently told us that more resources for early childhood education were also necessary if every student was going to be able to succeed. That's why the Student Success Act also makes substantial new investments in early childhood education, like Head Start, quality preschool, and early intervention and early childhood special education programs. The new investments also come with stricter accountability measures and a focus on equity to support traditionally underserved communities. These critical new investments will be paid for by a new corporate activities tax that will impact less than 10% of businesses that operate in Oregon. A complementary effort to the Student Success Act was Senate Bill 1049, the bill to help sustain the public employees' retirement system. Oregon is fortunate to have a well-run pension system for public employees. However, we also have a system burdened by past poor decisions as well as the ongoing impacts of the Wall Street crash due to the Great Recession. Without action this year, dramatic rate increases were slated to force school districts, local governments, and other public employers to make difficult decisions about service cuts and layoffs. The new PERS financing law will blunt the growth of the rate increases and protect the pension system by supporting employers' ability to fund the system. It will also help school districts and local governments redirect millions of dollars over the next decade to fund essential services and to support our public workforce. So let's move on to healthcare and Medicaid. As if funding K-12 and early childhood education wasn't enough, we also knew we needed to stabilize funding for our Oregon Medicaid system. In 2017, the legislature had continued short-term funding for the Oregon Health Plan, which was then affirmed by Oregonians at the ballot in early 2018 with the success of Measure 101. But we knew coming into the session that we again faced nearly $1 billion shortfall in future funding for Medicaid, putting healthcare access for our most vulnerable neighbors in jeopardy. So led by the governor's team, a lot of pre-session work went into creating a sustainable funding plan, which consequently allowed us to pass House Bill 2010 within the first 45 days of the legislative session. The new law extends an assessment on hospitals and insurers to create a 6-year funding stream for the Oregon Health Plan and allows the state to get significant federal matching funds. Additionally, one of the last bills that passed in the final weekend of the session was House Bill 2270, which is a referral to the voters for the November 2020 ballot to raise taxes on tobacco products. If passed, officials estimate the tax will raise approximately $340 million for the 21-23 biennium. The new money would be distributed on a 90-10 split, 90% for the Oregon Health Plan, with a special focus on mental health services, and 10% for tobacco prevention and cessation. It would also create, for the first time, a new tax on vaping products like e-cigarettes. So that will be on the ballot in November. So, new education investments, check. Medicaid stability, check. We moved on to housing. Because of this year's session, Oregon is now better positioned to address the ongoing statewide housing crisis. We pursued a 3-pronged strategy in the legislature. We wanted to protect renters, reduce the barriers to increasing our housing supply, and preserve and create more affordable housing. In 2017, there was a high-profile loss when a major tenant protection bill passed the House but died in the Senate. So I got to work trying to find a solution so we would be ready for this year's session. That work paid off, and by the end of February, we had passed Senate Bill 608, the first bill in the nation to create a statewide law against extreme rent gouging and establish a just cause standard for evictions. This new law will provide more protections and certainty for our tenants in a very unpredictable rental market. But these protections alone were not going to be enough. The combination of our limited statewide housing supply and our growing population require us to do more to address housing affordability. Two key pieces of legislation passed in the final weekend to make this goal a reality. House Bill 2001, which will re-legalize missing middle housing, such as duplexes and triplexes and townhomes, to allow construction in residential areas where these types of housing choices are currently not permitted. And House Bill 2003 will push the state to live up to the housing goal that is embedded in our land use system by giving local jurisdictions additional direction and resources to plan for their housing needs, something we haven't been doing here in the state. These bills maintain our statewide land use framework while providing local flexibility to make sure more people will have places to call home. Both of these bills received strong bipartisan support this session. And finally, on the housing front, our lead budget writers helped make sure we did as much as we could to bring additional state resources to address the housing crisis. Many of the budget items were in limbo until the very end of session, but fortunately, all the items were passed before we adjourned. Over the next 2 years, the state will devote more than $350 million in targeted investments to address the state's housing crisis, from emergency assistance for people experiencing homelessness, to preserving the existing stock of affordable housing, to making sure communities have additional financing tools to build the additional affordable housing that they so desperately need. We have made a difference on the housing crisis this session here in Oregon. The last of the big 4 priorities is carbon emission reduction and providing a path for Oregon to take bolder steps to adapt to the climate crisis. Like the student success effort, the Senate President and I convened a special joint committee on the topic, and even he and I co-chaired it during the interim because that's how much of a priority it was for both of us. Since 2007, Oregon has been grappling with how to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that can contribute to climate disruption. Over the last 4 years, there has been a lot of work between legislators and stakeholders to work on a market-based approach to require big polluters to pay for their emissions, to then take those resources to adapt to climate disruption, and to help the state get ahead economically during the transition to a clean energy future. I'm really proud of the work that was done by the Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction, especially the extensive public process that was involved to write such a complex piece of legislation. And I'm proud we got it through our chamber. The House passed it 2020 by 36 to 24 vote. And as you all know, the bill ran into some difficult headwinds in the Senate. We all know the science is clear. We know that the moral imperative is clear. We're facing a shrinking time window to take strong action to do our part to fight climate disruption. Every community in Oregon, especially those communities that are most dependent on natural resource industries, are at risk if we do not take bold action. And I am not giving up, and the Senate President and I are committed to bringing back a strong cap and invest bill next session. So these big 4 priorities would have been enough for any session, but other significant and long-standing issues had momentum as well. And we fortunately managed to find the time and energy to actually get those done in this session. So here's a sampling of other bills that in the future years are going to have tremendous impact on our state. And it's not everything that happened, but it is a sampling. Juvenile justice reforms. The legislature finally made substantial progress on how we sentence and treat youth offenders. While near the end of her long fight with lung cancer, a determined Senator Jackie Winters got Senate Bill 1008 through the Senate. The House followed suit a couple weeks later, passing a bill just a few days before Senator Winters passed away. The bill ensures that youth charged with mandatory minimum Measure 11 crimes will not automatically receive life sentences and will have greater access to second-look hearings halfway through their sentences. And furthermore, the bill requires additional steps before allowing prosecutors to put a youth offender into the adult prison system. This effort on this bill required a super majority, and we needed multiple Republican votes to get this done. Senator Winters' role made it possible to reach the necessary bipartisan threshold, allowing us to finally make sensible, evidence-based reforms to our juvenile justice system. Paid family and medical leave insurance. Also an issue that has been around for a couple sessions. With the passage of House Bill 2005 on the last day of session, Oregon workers will have access to paid family and medical leave insurance on January 1, 2023. Passed by bipartisan supermajority votes in both chambers, this new insurance benefit will allow workers to take up to 12 weeks of paid leave to care for or bond with a child during the first year after birth, adoption, or foster placement, care for oneself or a family member with a serious health condition, or to be off the job because of a domestic violence situation. An additional 2 weeks of paid leave will be available to those experiencing pregnancy complications. Employers and employees will share the cost of the system through payroll deductions, and this insurance will have the strongest wage replacement for low-wage workers in the nation of any paid family leave program. Driver's licenses. Oregonians will also have safer roads and a simpler way to drive legally after this session's work with the passage of House Bill 2015 on the second to last day of session. In 2021, Oregon residents who pass the written and driving tests, pay the fees, and provide proof of identity and residency will be able to get a standard driver's license. This change is part of the state's transition to providing enhanced security licenses as required by the federal government under Real ID. The bill includes anti-discrimination language for those with standard licenses or ID cards and explicitly states that they are not evidence of the holder's citizenship or immigration status. Diesel pollution. After several sessions of work, the legislature finally made notable progress on diesel pollution because of the passage of House Bill 2007 on the last day of the session. The new law sets deadlines for older, dirtier trucks to be retrofitted, repowered, or replaced within the Metro's 3-county area. It establishes clean contracting requirements for publicly funded construction projects within the metro area, and the bill also directs the use of $53 million in Volkswagen settlement fund dollars to help with this transition. It's about time we clean up the air in the Portland metro area. Campaign finance reform, also a topic of success for the session. The last 2 days of the session saw major progress on campaign finance reform. The biggest among them, Senate Joint Resolution 18, will allow voters to decide in November of 2020 whether to amend the Oregon Constitution to allow for campaign contribution limits. A bill to establish a comprehensive approach to establishing those specific limits passed the House but got stuck in the Senate, and we expect to revisit this issue next session so that voters will know the limits that they might be putting into place when they make the constitutional change. We also passed, that's a good one. We also passed 2 campaign finance transparency bills that will go into effect to help voters better understand who are actually involved in campaigns. House Bill 2983 requires more reporting from nonprofit organizations that contribute to partisan political activity. Right now, most of that money is unlimited and unreported at all. It's not reported. So that, I think, is good for transparency. Another bill, House Bill 2716, will require political advertisements to say who paid for them. So all these changes in campaign finance, I think, will be good for our process and good for voters. And finally, more of an internal conversation as it relates to the state capitol. Workplace culture in the Capitol. The year started out with increased attention on how we do our business in Salem, and it brought to light serious concerns about harassment and discrimination. Fortunately, we had lengthy recommendations from the Oregon Law Commission of how to change our policies and protocols to ensure a safe and supportive work environment. The Senate President and I convened the Joint Committee on Capitol Culture. It was a bicameral, evenly split, bipartisan committee that wrestled with the recommendations of the Oregon Law Commission. They produced 2 bills, House Concurrent Resolution 20 and House Bill 3377, which will create a new structure for the legislature to receive complaints and provide very needed clarity on how complaints of all kinds should be processed. We also will establish a legislative equity office that will be a nonpartisan, independent office within the branch that will oversee training and monitor progress through regular conduct, culture, and climate surveys. This new structure and the personnel rules that accompany it will allow us to move forward in a way that I think will provide public confidence that the legislature is providing a safe and supportive work environment. And Oregon's new policies and procedures on this matter, frankly, are a model for other state legislatures around the country. We will then be setting the standard for other legislatures to follow with these new rules. So finally, just to conclude, the 2019 session was certainly historic, exhausting, and dramatic, with an emphasis on the dramatic in the last 2 weeks. But despite those challenges, the legislature delivered for our state. I was, like many, and probably many in this room, incredibly disappointed by the fate of the carbon reduction bill. But we have a solid foundation to try again. And many bills need a second go around, and we will be back on that bill. I was incredibly frustrated and saddened by the Senate Republican walkout, but I would say that the decorum that we demonstrated in the House demonstrates that this does not have to be the new normal. We know how to do this, and I believe we can continue to do the good work in Oregon despite what happened on the Senate Republican side. Because no matter how hard the work is, we must endeavor to work together collaboratively for our state. I have a couple of my colleagues here today, Representative Nose, Representative Kenny Geyer. I want to thank you, as well as all of our colleagues. I want to thank everyone in the legislature who was away from their families for 6 months and working really hard for the benefit of our state. We have a lot to be proud of here in Oregon. When I addressed the full legislature back in January, when we were in our opening session, I identified the 4 major priorities that I outlined today on that day. And I said the way we tackle those major issues will define us as a state, and it will define us as leaders. And I can say with a lot of satisfaction that we led on those big issues. And even if all the priorities didn't cross the final finish line, we accomplished a lot. The events of the final weeks of June were disappointing and disturbing, and I hope and actually believe that they will become a historical footnote to what we did this legislative session. Because as we continue to live in very transformative and difficult times and face immense challenges, I am still optimistic that Oregon will continue to be a state that leads on big issues. And I believe that we will be a place where we do the work and the hard work to govern the way that people want us to govern. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention today and look forward to your questions.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I am Colin Jones, past president of City Club. We just heard from Oregon House Speaker Tina Kotek, and we will now have a two-part question and answer session. Part B will be our standard Q&A from the floor, but first, Part A will feature prepared questions from 5 individuals representing diverse communities across Oregon. We ask each speaker to offer a brief reflection on the legislative session and frame their question with an eye toward the future. How do we move forward from here? Each of these questions could likely warrant an entire Friday Forum of its own. Alas, we have just a few minutes for each one. So if I nudge a questioner towards the crux of your question, or if I nudge Speaker Kotek toward the crux of your answer, please know that I do so with love. Our first question comes from Ashley Henry from Business for a Better Portland.
Hi, thank you. Speaker Kotek, it was a pleasure for Business for a Better Portland to be able to join with other businesses supporting the Student Success Act from the very beginning. And we're thrilled, obviously, that you were successful. Businesses have a great interest in ensuring that we have a qualified workforce, and obviously the leaps that you made on K-12 are just one part of that. And I was hoping that you could speak to the historic under-resourcing of our colleges and universities and what you see coming up for that, because that's really important to the success of our economy.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to your organization and the broader business community for the tremendous support on the Student Success Act. On higher education, we, as I mentioned, prioritize K-12 and early childhood. Sometimes you have to put things first. That being said, on the higher education funding, even though we started off in the session worried that we wouldn't be able to get to a high enough level to avoid large tuition increases, we were successful by the end of session saying we at least have to keep tuition increases at a spot that can still try to make higher ed, community colleges and universities affordable here. I believe the governor and the Senate President and I will be convening here shortly to figure out how we talk about higher education funding in the state and higher education accountability, making sure that, as we're trying to do in K-12, to make sure new dollars go to producing the outcomes we want. So I'm optimistic we're going to get there, and I think that's the next education conversation for us. Thank you.
Our second question is from Felisa Higgins, Political Director of SEIU Local 49.
Speaker Kotek, thank you so much for your leadership on housing. I believe without you, this session wouldn't have happened, and we would have the continued growth and homelessness that we have seen in our area. This is the City Club of Portland, and both you and I live in the neighborhoods that are the last bastion of affordability. I live in Lentz, which, as I'm seeing, transform into one of the most expensive housing areas in our community. And I look at our members throughout the state, those who live in Bend and Medford and Ashland, who can no longer afford to own homes, let alone rent homes. The things you've done this session really have focused on keeping tenants in their house, but also on low-income Oregonians. The new missing middle is that middle-income Oregonian who can rent but never can afford to own. And so I'm looking to you to answer what's next on home ownership for our community and that middle income housing.
Thank you, Felisa, and thank you for your work during the session on housing. The first thing we need to do on all the great work we did this session on housing is to make sure it's working and being implemented. I think one of the things that people forget, you pass a law, but then you have to make sure it works. So whether that's the renter protections or the missing middle on the supply side, we have to make sure our agencies and our local governments are actually doing what they need to be doing. So that's job number one. On the homeownership side, I am very much looking forward to the recommendations of the task force on racial disparities in home ownership. They will have recommendations in September, and that's a committee that's been working about a year or so now. There are barriers to underserved communities being able to purchase their home, and I suspect we will be taking up those topics in the February session. I also believe that with more construction of different types of more affordable housing options, that there will be better pathways to home ownership. We have to incentivize that. So we have to come back and talk about how do we incentivize local communities and maybe some help from the state that missing middle will also provide home ownership opportunities for as many Oregonians as possible. We need support along the entire housing continuum, and people need to be able to buy their home and take advantage of the tax breaks that are related to that. So I assume home ownership will be a big topic in the year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes in from Eastern Oregon. Hermiston Mayor Dave Drotzman couldn't join us in Portland today, so he sent us his question via video. And if the technology gods are with us, we will now watch that.
Hello, my friends in Portland. This is Mayor Dave Drotzman from the city of Hermiston, where we are in the middle of harvesting our world-famous Hermiston watermelons. By the way, we'll be bringing a truckload of our beautiful harvest to share with the Portland community for free on Friday, August 2nd at Pioneer Square. Mayor Wheeler and myself will have our annual watermelon seed spitting contest. So Mayor Wheeler, if you're there, I hope you've been practicing. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to ask this question, but I want to thank the Portland City Club and Caitlin Baggett Davis for inviting me to participate in the conversation. So my question, in reference to how do we move forward from here, revolves around PERS. First, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Speaker Kotek for her past service to this state, and specifically her leadership in helping to pass Senate Bill 1049. This legislation recognized the significant burden PERS had placed on our state, schools, cities, and counties. The city of Hermiston will see a 29% increase in PERS this year and a 40% increase next. PERS continues to be a sizable budgetary concern for local government. We continue to see significant portions of our general fund used to meet PERS obligations, which comes at the expense of other services. I realize Speaker Kotek and the current legislators in the building didn't create this problem, but it's the current crisis facing our leaders and the one we must work together to solve. So my question is, how do we come together as a state to keep our schools and communities fiscally healthy, honor our past commitments, and address this continued crisis? And are there any current conversations taking place in the Capitol around additional solutions for local governments and districts? Thank you, Speaker Kotek. Thank you, Portland City Club. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'm a terrible watermelon spitter, so just for what it's worth. That's a really good question. We have to continue to come together as a state. And just generally speaking to the question, how do we move forward on difficult topics across the board, whether it's making sure we can continue to afford our pension system and the very real challenges that local governments are facing. We need to keep talking, keep listening, keep communicating. One of the things that I have been proud of since I've been speaker is we have a legislative exchange program where our urban and rural legislators cross party lines, go visit each other in each other's districts during the interim. And it really is enlightening for people to see what happens in North Portland. I went to Klamath Falls last year. So I think that kind of communication to educate all legislators about the challenges in different parts of the state is just a foundational piece. In terms of what we can do as it relates to the PERS costs, I think we have stabilized the system. And frankly, one of the biggest disappointments from the session was our inability to come together to use the kicker refund money to help buy down the unfunded liability. That was a straight partisan problem. And we overcome those problems by talking and listening, because I do believe that local government has a very difficult challenge on their hands. That was one of the reasons when we did some of the housing work with House Bill 2001 and 2003 that I was crystal clear with folks. You cannot ask local government to do more unless you give them resources. And we did that. And we're going to have to keep doing that. So I look forward to working with, whether it's the mayor of Hermiston or any other of the mayors who have very difficult jobs. We're going to listen. We want to hear your ideas, because we are definitely all in this together. So thank you for the question.
Our fourth question comes from Jenny Lee, representing APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Speaker Kotek, for being here to speak with us about the legislative session. From my own perspective, I absolutely largely agree that we've seen historic wins, including on issues that have been years in the making and will have very positive, substantial outcomes for communities of color. At the same time, I'm often asked, and I think whether in actuality or in perception, that that communities of color are not centered in the decision-making process. That while we may be consulted, we are not truly giving consent to how policies move forward. That folks who are actually at decision-making spaces are not necessarily inclusive. So do you see that this is a sort of legislative reality until we have more representative representation in our legislature of Oregonians of color? And specifically, how do you see your leadership as moving the stakeholders who have not always been friendly to our interests, as well as your colleagues, toward inclusive decision-making and actual policy outcomes that will consistently benefit communities of color and recognize their priorities? And I'd also like to thank you personally as well for the opportunity to work with you. So.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for the question. In my 7th year now as speaker, I have noticed a real change in participation in terms of diverse voices coming to the Capitol and being part of the process. And the fundamental reality is legislating in a representative democracy is often quick and messy and very hard to get full engagement at all parts of the process, especially when we're in Salem, which is many miles away from where people live and have time to communicate. That being said, I think one of the key ways to get around that as we continue to have more diverse representation in the Capitol is all that pre-session work that happens that I mentioned in my speech. If we can identify and work through topics of interest in a very collaborative fashion with all communities, particularly communities who don't often come to the Capitol or aren't as heard, and have those values set early on, they will guide how we finish legislation. I know it gets challenging when things happen in the heat of the session, but if we start early and establish strong guidelines of what we're trying to achieve together, then I feel like the product at the end will be better and will also reflect those different voices. It's a little messy and doesn't always happen that way, but I think we have done a lot better in our coalition work here in the state to do that kind of early work, because honestly, people can't be in the Capitol every moment of every day. They can't be in every meeting and when decisions get made. But I feel like in my leadership, I have brought equity and those voices to the table to the best of my ability, and it's because talking to people before we get into the room is really key. So we have work to do, and but let's keep trying to perfect that. So thank you.
Thank you. Our last prepared question comes from 2 climate activists who have pushed hard for the recent Cap and Invest legislation. 15-year-old Charlie Abrams is the co-founder of Affected Generation, and 13-year-old Yusuf Arifin is a climate activist who attends Sunset High School in Beaverton.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Charlie Abrams. I'm 15.
And I'm Yusuf Arifin, and I'm 13 years old.
First off, I want to thank you for your leadership in getting House Bill 2020 passed through the Senate. I've been pushing for this bill since I was like 10, so this is extremely important to me and my generation. But how do you think you can support the governor in her efforts to pass Cap and Invest this year? And then we've kind of a 2-part question.
And secondly, my family loves to travel around the world, and recently we've been to Chile and Tanzania, And after seeing how badly their environments have been impacted by climate change, I have no doubt that this is the biggest issue facing our generation. So how can youth support and engage in the process to pass Cap and Invest this year?
Well, Charlie and Yusuf, first of all, thank you. The role of our young activists on House Bill 2020 was really important. And honestly, you have to keep the adults accountable and keep pressing, because we get distracted and a lot of things have to get done. But the climate bill is the priority for the state. It has to be the priority. All these other things don't make any sense if we don't have a planet left to live. So in terms of supporting the governor, I will say that the governor and the Senate President and I continue to be jointly committed to passing Cap and Invest. There is no other choice here. This idea that there's some other better plan out there is not realistic. We have to do a better job of explaining what that bill does. And because there are good things in that bill for every community in the state, and frankly, we probably didn't do a good enough job communicating that. So our job is to get it done. I don't know about this year, but definitely next year at the latest, because when we're back in legislative session. The bottom line goal is to get it done. I don't really care which pathway we take, but we need to get it done because we still want to be on track to start in 2021. So thank you, and keep up the good work, and do not lose hope. We're going to get it done. So thank you.
Thank you for everyone who asked a question and for your brevity. For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Colin Jones, past president of City Club. We're now going to open the floor to audience questions for Speaker Kotek. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag Friday Forum. To City Club members who would like to ask a question at the mic, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. I know we'll all have a lot of questions for the speaker, and so I will be particularly encouraging of brevity today. We'll take the first question.
Yes, my name is Tom Dyke. I'm a City Club member, and I was also a member of the City Club Earthquake Resilience Research Committee, which released its report 2 years, big steps before the big one. And my question is about something that hasn't been mentioned yet today, and that was House Bill 3309. This bill authorized construction of public buildings, or permitted the construction of public buildings in the tsunami zone. Since it's likely that those buildings will be destroyed in a tsunami from a Cascadia earthquake, which is predicted with 20% probability in the next 50 years, with destruction of buildings and loss of life. Would you comment on why this authorization was made, which I think is a big step backwards?
Thank you for your
from
question.
Earthquake resilience.
Thank you, Tom. So House Bill 3309, currently under the statute that got changed, the agency in charge of mapping had stronger authority to keep anything from being constructed in a tsunami zone. The bill changes that, but I do believe, and here's one of the reasons why. The legislators from the coast said, we can't even have access, we can't relocate every building that's in the tsunami zone. And because of the Dogami restrictions, we can't even get additional money to upgrade the buildings or retrofit them or anything like that. So the coastal communities are saying, give us a little more flexibility. We certainly know the dangers of building there, and we don't have anywhere else to go, and we can't relocate the buildings that are in those areas. So I think, I will be honest, the New Yorker article I think went a little over the top. I can see the concern, but I think the flexibility from the coastal communities was, we're trying to do what we can, and you're hamstringing us to even be able to live there and try to make our community safer. So I'm not sure if that answers it, but I think the bill is not as bad as everyone thought it was. So.
Speaker Kotek, can people hear me? I don't know where the mic is. Congratulations on a very good session, and as you said, you made progress on the education, the Medicare support, and the housing. And I think, like you said, there was a lot of work that went into the climate bill, But one of the things that I think you have probably discovered with the success of the first 3 issues is working with both sides and coming to consensus and engaging the Republican leadership early on so that they don't get locked into a position and the Democratic side doesn't get locked into a position.
Do you have a question coming?
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
what steps are you going to take to avoid sides getting locked down? For example, I know you're already doing this, more meetings behind closed doors so that people can say what their constituency is driving them to do.
Thank you.
More respect for each other's priorities.
Thank you for your question. I'm
And
sorry to
you-
interrupt you.
and you
Tina
should
Kotek,
negotiate.
how would you address the question of how do you sort of get past
Well,
folks getting
I want to
entrenched?
be really upfront with everyone here. Day 1 of the session, Senate Republicans and House Republicans were not going to be supporting House Bill 2020. This has now become a partisan issue in a way that is really unhelpful. That being said, I met with the House Republican leader every week, and I would continually say, what do you need? How can we make this work? What are your concerns? When they asked for meetings on the road, we said, sure, let's do as many as we can. When we needed, there were hundreds of amendments to that bill, 100 plus amendments, that's the evidence of a really good inclusive process. There's a change, let's keep making it, let's keep making it, let's keep making it. I don't know if we can get over some of the fear of the bill, but we're going to have to try. We're going to have to go out to each community and say, tell us what's not working. Here's what the bill really actually does. What doesn't work? Because I think there was a real disconnect between who was in the Capitol representing those communities. And I will own up to the fact we didn't communicate well, and we can't stop trying, so we're going to keep trying. So I don't know if that helps, but this is a very difficult issue because there are forces in this state who do not want that bill to pass. And I don't believe it's average Oregonians across the state, so we're going to have to keep working on it.
Steve, I know you're great at being punchy, so model a brief question for us.
First of all, Speaker Kotek, I think you should take credit for House Bill 2001 as a climate bill because when people live closer together, they generate lower carbon emissions. My question, though, is this. When you think of great speakers in history, 2 names come to mind. Sam Rayburn, the longest-serving speaker in the U.S. House, and Tris Speaker, the great center fielder for the Boston Red Sox and Cleveland Indians, who's still in the top 10 all-time of wins above replacement.
Steve.
Which of those two do you identify with more?
Neither. I think I'm better looking. So.
Sam, thank you.
That's a hard act to follow.
It is.
I'm Sam Metz, City Club member. The discord in the legislature reflected not just a political division between Democrat and Republican, but a cultural divide between urban and rural. 28 out of Oregon's counties gave a majority to Donald Trump. Clearly, there's an entire rural culture out there that feels disenfranchised by the legislature. What do you think the leaders in the state legislature can do to repair the apparent distrust that's growing between rural and urban Oregon?
Thank you, Sam. I think we're a microcosm of what's happening nationally. The inability of communities that look very different to be able to communicate with each other. And there's a lot of fear out there. Again, I think I've mentioned this before, we're going to have to visit and talk and listen. Because I know, for example, on the housing issue, my folks in North Portland and Northeast Portland need housing. They need affordable housing. And so do the folks in Klamath Falls and Madras and Ontario. So we have to find common ground. And I think issue by issue, conversation by conversation, we will get there. It just takes a lot of work.
We're going to take
Thank
a
you.
question from the card. I was disappointed when Governor Brown bargained away SB 978, the Omnibus Gun Violence Prevention Bill. What will you and fellow legislators do to ensure the passage of this bill?
Thank you for the question. Senate Bill 978 was a comprehensive approach to moving forward on additional gun safety legislation in Oregon. I won't speak to what happened with the governor on that one, but what I will say is we have made progress on gun safety. We have to continue to make progress on gun safety, and our priority bill on the topic for the upcoming session will be the safe storage legislation that has already been put out there as a ballot measure. Let's talk about safe storage in the short session, and I think that will be progress we can actually achieve.
Ruby Houghton Pitts, AARP Oregon State Director. Speaker Kotek, thank you so much for working so hard for Oregonians. And I want to say, 3 cheers for you, and now it's time to move on. And so tell me, as it relates to age discrimination, recognizing that no matter who you are, what party you are, if you are lucky, you're going to get older. So we had an age discrimination bill that was before this legislature. And basically what we were asking was to ban the age box. Let's look at people based on the merit and the work that they can do rather than crossing them off for age alone.
A question, please.
We'd like to know what it is you're going to do to push forward an age discrimination bill that will stop employers from cutting off people because of their age, not because of the work that they are able to do.
Thank
We're
you.
planning on
Thank you
living
for
a
that
long
question.
time.
Thank you, Ruby, and thank you for the work. And I'm glad that AARP is prioritizing this issue. Age discrimination is real, and I think we saw it particularly after people were going back into the workforce after the recession and not being able to be reemployed. We did have a bill, and we've had conversations about how we move forward. I will be leading up a work group to look at the age discrimination bill again. We did pass a major workplace harassment bill in the session, Senate Bill 726, so I feel like we've made some really good progress, and age discrimination is the next topic on workplace protection. So looking forward to working with you on that, Ruby. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Kathy Moyd, member of City Club. I was just wondering, with the census coming up in 2020 with redistricting and the possibility that Oregon may actually pick up another congressional seat, is there any consideration of changing to a commission form of redistricting?
Thank you for the question. At this point, I am not aware of anything that has momentum in terms of changing how we do redistricting here in the state. If I would remind folks, back in 2010, the last time we did the last 2010 census in the 2011 session, we were actually in co-governance, which the House was evenly split. We did redistricting. It was bipartisan, and it was an evenly split committee. Perhaps we go back to that methodology within the legislature. That redistricting plan was bipartisan, wasn't challenged in the courts, and frankly reflected the communities of interest across the state. As regards to the census, what I will say on that is I want to thank the governor and Representative Andrea Salinas in particular for encouraging the state to invest money in the next year on census outreach work. We are not going to get the help from the federal government on the census. So for the first time, we have allocated about $10 million over the next year to work with community groups to get the message out that people need to complete the census and do that. We need to get counted, and states are going to have to step up and do it because the federal government is not doing what they have normally done in the past.
Take a question from the internet. The battle over cap and trade has often been reduced to environmentalists versus industry, but the fight was more complicated than that. Some environmental justice activists rooted in communities of color and other climate activists oppose this legislation almost as strongly as industry lobbyists. So, given that the bill is taking heat from both the right and left, is this really the best approach to climate legislation?
Thank you for the question. Well, one of the maxims in the building, if both sides on the ends of the debate don't like it, then it must be a pretty good bill. That being said, we have a very strong piece of legislation. Yes, There were some groups who did not like it and wanted something more ideal. We had a bill that could pass and still meet our emission reduction goals. I think, if I can for just a second, the biggest issue right now, if we want to help people be secure and stable as our climate changes, we need to talk about income inequality. We have to talk about poverty. Communities in our state who are worried about their way of life are worried because they are worried about the economics. If we are going to make the absolutely necessary changes around our environment as it relates to climate, people have to feel secure financially to help make that transition. So we need to come back to the conversation of wages and financial stability in our communities in Oregon if we're also going to do this successfully.
Thank you.
Speaker Kotek, Maxine Dexter, City Club member. Thank you so much for your leadership and for taking a hard stand on lots of challenging issues. I'd like to see the legislature be more successful in keeping all members engaged, and I wonder what you as a leader think you can use in your toolbox for using norms of behavior and codes of conduct to self-govern in a way that maybe you could avoid walkouts in the future.
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, voters have to be paying attention. If voters are not happy about people walking out, they need to tell their legislators in those districts. I'm not sure that's going to completely happen, but voters need to take a stance. We do in Oregon, after a little research, have one of the highest quorum requirements for work in the legislature, higher than most any other state, with a super majority. We might have to look at that. That's a constitutional change. Those are structural things. At the end of the day, we had respectful conversations on the House side. I don't know what happened on the Senate side. I'm not going to point fingers. We cannot be polarized. We have to come and do our work. And in a representative democracy, the minority and the majority each have roles. And we have to respect each other, but we have to go and do the work. And I hope this is a blip. I really do. I spoke with Senate Republicans when they were out of the building, when they were in another state. They were struggling of trying to figure out how they can respect the will of what they think are their voters, and also be good public servants. I'm glad they came back. I'm glad we got as much done as we possibly got done on the last couple days of session, and let's hope that that never happens again. That's going to take a lot of very hard conversations with those folks.
And with that hope for greater collaboration, our time is up for the day. Please, let's start with a round of applause for Speaker Kotek.
Thank you.
We are so grateful for everyone who made today's forum possible. Thank you to Speaker Kotek for helping us understand the session. Thank you to Chalkboard Project and the Oregonian for sponsoring today's forum. Thank you to Andrew Collick and Caitlin Baggett-Davis for co-producing today's program. And thanks all of you for joining us. One more round of applause for everyone who made today possible.